fool the public, as they said, for even one time period. Therefore, the government can do nothing to actually make the economy operate any better, and the best thing the government can do is get out of the way. Now, that's really the line they're selling.
Why is it then that I can't recall ever seeing papers from central banking economists proclaiming that the central banks should be abolished?
That's a funny one. They believe that they should be in control of the money supply. The economists dominate the central bank. And there's been a long debate in the whole circle of central banks about the role they should play. And they don't. There is a clash between wanting a private sector for the productive side of the economy and then wanting to control the money supply on the other side. Again, what they see themselves as in reserve banks is bastions against the government, defending the private sector against the profligate behavior of politicians. And whereas politicians might want to pork barrel and run deficits all the time, they see themselves as playing a countervailing force of restricting the government's capacity to spend and create money. So, again, they have a schizophrenic relationship to the government sector, not the sort of position you might expect at all from because they are employed by the government, therefore they'll be pro the government. It is a strange world.
So even though they will advocate the destruction of, or they'll advocate less government interference in economies. You're saying that very few economists seem to be opposed to central banks.
Yeah, most of them are in favor of central banks, and it's because central banks are run by economists that they're in favor of them. It's quite strange, isn't it?
Well, I mean, doesn't the Federal Reserve employ, thousands of PhD economists or something like that?
Yes, they do. Yeah. And the strange thing about economics is that because there's not just one school of thought in economics. If I want to go through the basic range of different paradigms that apply in how people think the economy operates, the dominant one is the neoclassical, which argues that the economy is self-equilibrating and is always in equilibrium, and they have a very mathematical way of trying to model that, but a mathematics that is based in the early 19th century, rather than using modern techniques like from chaos theory and so on. Then you have another group called Austrian economists who share the same value basis as the neoclassicals, arguing that capitalism is all about utility maximizing, consumers interacting with profit maximizing firms, and that the capitalist economy is the best way to organize human society. But they argue that the system is almost out of equilibrium, and in fact it's the disequilibrium elements of capitalism that make it creative, because that disequilibrium gives entrepreneurs a chance to innovate, and the innovation is what drives growth and development in capitalism. So then I see that as being more realistic spin on the neoclassical foundations. The other extreme, you have Marxists who argue that the capitalist system is always heading for crisis. It was based on the exploitation of labor, and as the ratio of capital to labor rises, there'll be a crisis in the capacity of capitalism to generate a profit. Then you have a group called post-Keynesians who argue that Keynes was totally misinterpreted by the neoclassicals, and Keynes's views are about a system with financial cycles, inherent instability, and so on, but not necessarily tendency to break down. Clearly, I'm closer to that end of the spectrum than most others. And now physicists are getting involved as well and saying, listen, guys, you and your schools of thought have all been a load of, crock of nonsense. Let's get out there and empirically analyze the system, take some leads from physics perhaps to work out how to analyze the dynamics of complex systems, and then build a new empirically based economics as well. And then there are people who call themselves institutional evolutionary economists who see the economy as being basically a system with evolutionary change over time. Now, that range of views will be expressed in virtually every academic economic department, because people will be trained in the mainstream stuff, and then at a certain point they'll go through an epiphany and think, this is all garbage. I've got to find some other way of thinking about the world. They'll search around and find an Austrian perspective or a post-Keynesian or a evolutionary, and that'll appeal to them, and they'll suddenly become a different type of economist in an academic department. And then the remaining ones who still believe in neoclassical shun them, but they find a minority of people through other schools that they can still talk with, and you then have a community of academics who are dissidents to the mainstream. That doesn't happen in central banks. If you apply for a job at a central bank and you're not a mainstream thinker, you'll be shunted somewhere else. The bureaucratic process will normally refine you out of existence. In fact, the only central banker that I can think of who was anything at all close to non-orthodox is a guy called Bill White, who was the research director for the Bank of International Settlements for a long time and became a great fan of the work of Hyman Minsky. And frankly, most of the stuff that I saw coming out of the BIS when Bill White was the director there, I could have written, I would proudly have put my name to it. But he was always shadowed down by Alan Greenspan and all the other central bankers who were complete believers in the neoclassical vision of the system always being in equilibrium. And ironically, their theories of how the financial system works argue that money doesn't matter. So their models, these are the guys controlling the money supply, and most of the macroeconomic models don't talk about money and certainly don't include private debt in them. It's no damn wonder they didn't see the financial crisis coming.
Well, what kind of what school did Hyman Minsky belong to then?
Minsky has an interesting history. His mum and dad met at a Communist Party function back, I think, in 1919 or something like that. So you get an idea of the background was belief in the theories of Karl Marx and so on. Minsky went off to the Second World War as an army boy fighting over the American cause in Europe, and came back and then did a mathematics degree, and then had his PhD supervisor, a guy called Joseph Schumpeter, who in my opinion was the best product of the Austrian school and the person who really gave us a formal basis for evolutionary thought in economics. So Minsky's background was a combination of Schumpeter and Marx, but he'd never admit to Marx, of course, because since he was an academic in America in the 1950s, it was a death. It was you signing your own death warrant if you even mentioned you even knew who Marx was under the McCarthyist days. So Marx was an influential part of his thinking. He never used Marx openly, and as Joan Robinson once commented, Joseph Schumpeter is marked with the adjective changed anyway, so he would put himself across as a Schumpeterian. Then he saw that comment from the paper from Keynes in the 1937 paper, and he started calling himself a form of post-Keynesian, though he really isn't completely in the post-Keynesian camp. He's still got a very strong leg in the Schumpeterian and institutional end of the spectrum. I come at that, I'm now regarded as probably the world's leading developer of Minsky's theories since his death, and I come at Minsky's perspective from a combination of those points of view plus a background in mathematical physics.
Well, what about Hayek? Would Minsky have disagreed with Hayek's viewpoint then?
There's Hayek's viewpoint is a complex one because Hayek is certainly part of the Austrian school, and a lot of Hayek's arguments are really that you have an excessive emphasis on what I could see an a priori argument that you can work out what capitalism is like from your own armchair. However, one of the major things that Hayek gave us was an argument about the importance of uncertainty, and that's definitely a major element in Keynes' thinking and certainly in Minsky's thinking. So from a Hayekian point of view, you argue there's no possibility of a centrally planned economy, nor is there any possibility, one that works for a long time, nor is there any possibility of analyzing capitalism as an equilibrium system, which is what the neoclassicals do. And he emphasizes the importance of uncertainty in finance and so on. So there are certainly strong elements of a Hayekian sympathy in Minsky's views, but Minsky at the same time differs in a lot of ways. So one of the major ones I'll highlight is that the Hayekian view about the role of finance is largely to say that if interest rates are set too low, then there'll be too much money being borrowed, you'll get a boom, that'll cause a crisis. So it sees the system having sort of a natural balance around when the interest rate is correct to equate flows of savings and borrowing. Minsky's argument is money is endogenously created by the banking sector, and the banking sector will have a tendency to create as much debt as it possibly can, and you'll therefore get a tendency to debt bubbles and so on, not completely regardless of the interest rate, but the interest rate alone isn't the only element that will give you instability. So there's a simpler argument which Peter Schiff has put forward prior to the crisis we're just in right now, and Schiff being a classic Austrian on that front, that it was all caused by the Central Reserve keeping rates too low between 2001 and 2006. If you take a Minskyan view, you argue it all goes right back to 1945 when the financial sector was willing to lend to anybody because the more debt it creates, the more money it makes. And you slowly had the building up of a Ponzi scheme in the American financial system dating right back to 1945. So there are elements where there's commonalities with Hayek, but I certainly wouldn't say. I'd say that Minsky has sympathies that direction, but it was certainly not the same camp.
Well, the thing that gets me about a lot of these schools of economics, and Minsky might be a little different, but with most of them, they all seem to presume that there is some end goal that's right or wrong. And they seem to obsess with what is the right policy mechanism and what are the right levers to pull or push in order to achieve some goal of some Goldilocks economy. And the very thought, I got to say, I find somewhat repugnant, because that's basically saying that somebody is using their judgment to dictate what they think is best for mankind and for society. And I find that somehow distasteful. And I mean, maybe this sounds very cruel, but in a way, in my view, it's like if people make in their own individual decisions end up leading to recessions or depressions, well, that's the way it is. And why is that good or bad? It just is. And the only thing that bugs me,
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Keep going. Yeah.
And just to complete the thought, it's that the thing that does get in my ire up, though, is when I see governments, and I include when I think of government, I think of central banks in that, because I do believe they're tools of they are a form of government, whether they're elected or not. They are a form of government and governance. And what makes me upset is when they try to manipulate the economy, and whether they're doing it, whether they could say if somebody can even theoretically could prove to me, like mathematical proof, that the central banks lead to greater quality of life and greater standards of living, I would still think it's wrong, because I just don't think it's right for that somehow it's subverting people making decisions that they would do on their own. Anyway, that's my rant.
Well,